Go ahead. Make my day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whiteline. I am the Rebel Broker, licensed real estate broker in the state of California. Member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. So good to have you here with me. I gotta tell you, you guys, sometimes you guys blow my mind. We talk about a lot of stuff on this show, right? Lots of real estate things. I tweet all kinds of data. We cover it all as much as we can because knowledge is power, right? So of the shows I've done over the last couple of weeks, what generated some of the highest number of questions from folks out there in the world? What brand of caffeine pill do I use? I don't know if it was last show or the show before, but I casually mentioned that I was taking caffeine pills instead of drinking a lot of coffee. And it wasn't an overwhelming number, but I had a few people reach out and they went, "Oh, hey, what are you taking?" Maybe I should do a show on the selection of caffeine tablets because, like I do with everything else, I obsess over numbers. So there you go. I did go through a way too complicated process to decide what caffeine pills to take. Anyway, we'll save that for another time. Today, we are going to have a very interesting conversation about what appears to be a continuing change in the rental landscape. Now, we've been talking about this for a while because we're heading into a very interesting period of time. We've talked about the fact that multifamily construction has kind of dominated the new construction scene, and particularly here in the area where I live, in the Silicon Valley area, that has equaled gigantic apartments or gigantic apartment complexes that are very light on amenities, light on pleasant surroundings, and heavy on people packed together as densely as possible. In fact, there are several brand spanking new apartment complexes that, in my mind, within a decade or so, are people are going to have a heck of a time getting folks to move into these places. Now, in terms of trends I'm seeing on the ground right now, I drive by these places pretty frequently. I tend to drive the major arteries of Silicon Valley on a pretty regular basis as I go to listing appointments or I show homes. So I'm always heading up the 85. I'm always heading up the 101, 680, 280, all the main drags. So and of course, a lot of the big apartment complexes are right off of these. One I've mentioned on the show many times before is right off of the 85 freeway at the southern end of the 85, just before it hits the 101 freeway. And I'll tell you, it's interesting to see on these buildings incentives. You know, first month free. You'll get a free microwave, free all kinds of free stuff to entice people. And it makes you wonder what's going on there. Now, the theory we were pushing was that eventually those things would experience that, right? The apartment complexes. The least desirable place to live is an apartment complex. So given an opportunity or having other options, folks will leave them. But, you know, we've also seen so few construction sites where they're building single-family residential homes, at least ones that you can afford. So the idea of transitioning from being a renter in an apartment to being an owner of a home is really difficult here with average home prices being way up there. But now what we're seeing is the trends that we were talking about here a year ago, 2 years ago in semi-isolated places. Remember, we started talking about the challenge to rents in New York a while back. We're starting to see a broadening into markets that a lot of pundits thought were bulletproof. Of course, we all know there's no such thing as a bulletproof market. Anyone who has lived through the 2007-2008 downturn know that no matter how good you think things are, they can absolutely take a turn for the worse. We've been sort of trying to mentally prepare for that and fiscally prepare for that here on this show for a while. But I wanted to discuss today some very interesting things we're seeing in some very interesting markets. This comes to us from National Real Estate Investor. This is a nreionline.com is the website. Excuse me. And I've started recently consuming these folks' stuff a lot more. They've got some really interesting topics that they cover, so I think it's worth discussing those here on the show. Now, the first community they point out is a bit of a shocker because it's continued to be sort of the new up-and-comer. It's the city where everyone was expecting it to just continue to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up and really push the boundaries in terms of prices. It's one I'm familiar with. It's one we've talked about directly before since I moved my son up to a suburb of Seattle. It's interesting to see these kinds of stories come out of Seattle. Their median rents did not budge at all in July, and that's after a 5% annual increase a year earlier and a 10% increase the year before, and that's according to Zillow data on apartments, houses, and condos. That's the biggest decline among the top 50 largest metropolitan areas. It's part of a national trend, according to these folks. Rents, and this is also amazing because I want you to digest the cities we're talking about here. Because they have all figured prominently in some of these reports we've done, some of these bits of data we've covered that talk about areas with the biggest growth. And some of these are encouraging because it might mean more affordability in these areas for investors to jump in, depending on where you think things are going to continue going. Or if you think this is the sign of more of the same to come, it could still spell an opportunity, just one you might want to wait for. All right, so rents have also gone down in Nashville, at Portland, Oregon. They've actually started falling. In the U.S., rents were up just 0.5% in July. Now, remember, we're talking about July, and we talk a lot on the show about being aware of seasonal influences of data, right? Well, July is one of those months when everyone is moving, right? Whether you're looking to buy a house or sell a house and move yourself, or just move, you typically want to do it when the weather is nice and when kids aren't in school or when it's the easiest. And across the country, that tends to be, late April, June, July, August. And so you wouldn't expect this to be down. Now, granted, it's down in comparison to the same time last year. So the seasonal stuff is kind of taken into account by doing it that way. Let's see, the smallest gain for any month since 2012, a 0.5% gain in July. And that's the smallest gain for any month, not just the month of July, but any month since 2012. Okay, then there's a bunch of junk we don't care about. There's one interesting sort of anecdotal story. There was a real estate agent last month helping clients who were looking for an apartment in Seattle. They looked at 7 places and narrowed it down to 2, a 5-story building with a rooftop dog park and an air-conditioned gym and a newly remodeled 7-story tower that won their business by throwing in a year of free underground parking, normally a $175 a month charge. So it's interesting to see this. Now, here's what I'm going to suggest you do. And here's something I think you should always have in the back of your head. This is actual data relating to rentals, right? But something anecdotal that someone probably could have kind of clued into earlier is exactly what I clued into a few months ago when I was driving by apartment buildings and I was seeing incentives being thrown out. Now, sometimes there's super ridiculous incentives that don't carry with them a great deal of value. So it's not just about the fact that incentives are thrown out there, it's what the incentives are. There was one place I drove by where the first 2 months rent was free. Well, that's interesting because in this area, that's $6,000, right? That's a lot of money. So it's interesting to see substantial cuts or substantial losses being taken through the incentives that are being offered for folks to move into their units. And keep in mind, the only reason to do that is to get yourself rented, implying that you have not been able to get yourself rental just based off of demand. You're now having to increase the demand for your particular unit by increasing the potential rewards that you're handing out. Even condo owners with just 1 or 2 units to rent are offering concessions to compete with new buildings. Quote, a lot of them are going from absolutely no pets to allowing pets. That's a big deal in Seattle, where everybody has a dog or a cat. All right, so what does that mean to you? Well, if you're someone who owns a single-family residential home, my bet is that you are the least affected by a lot of this stuff. And that's the way it always plays out. Apartments are affected the most. Condos are affected next, depending on what condos are in your area. If condos in your area are really just apartments by another name, and people, and it's going to be the same thing. Now, I understand this is a typical thing in Seattle, where for whatever reason, because of zoning laws or what it costs to get things built, they'll do this thing where they will build apartments with the idea that they're going to end up being condos at some point. So I think the good news there is folks in Seattle, or at least in Redmond, when I was in Redmond, which is where my son was, I looked at an awful lot of different buildings, and I got in a chat with a real estate agent, and he was telling me that's kind of the way things go. If you have it as an apartment and then you eventually eventually turn it into a condo. I guess you can't get permits to build condos, but you can get permits to build apartments, and then they have to stay apartments for some period of time. I don't know. I'm not totally up to date on my Seattle what you have to do to get around regulations stuff, but it sounds like that's what you have to do there. According to this, tremendous competition is really the byline right now in Seattle. Batik, a new 195-unit Seattle apartment building, has views of the downtown skyline and Mount Rainier, a giant rooftop deck with a garden where tenants can grow fruits and vegetables, a community barbecue, and an off-leash pet area. New tenants can receive Visa gift cards worth as much as $6,000, with half paid at signing and the rest a month later. In Seattle, another factor contributed to the glut of rentals. While the city is in the midst of a building boom, with more cranes dotting the skyline than any other in the United States, much of the residential multifamily construction has been apartments. Developers have shied away from condos because of state laws that allow buyers to more easily sue if there are defects in the construction. So maybe that's why they do the apartment to condo thing. U.S. multifamily apartment construction for the past few years have been at levels not seen since the 1980s, and rapid rent gains have also encouraged owners of single-family homes and condos to fill them with tenants. Projects opening now were conceived by developers a few years ago when rent gains in the U.S. were peaking at an annual gain of 6.6%, according to Zillow data. Now, this is exactly what we were talking about on this show. If we were overbuilding anything, we were overbuilding apartments. I think for a lot of these apartment complexes, what's also particularly annoying is, at least the ones I'm seeing here in Silicon Valley, there's one that jumps to mind, which is literally just sardine cramped. If they were to try to sell those things as condos, they're going to get not great prices for those, simply because even in the world of condos, they're the least desirable of those. So I think a lot of these builders have kind of put themselves into a corner here with some of this stuff. The most expensive markets slowed first as new supply became available and tenants struggled to afford rapidly rising lease rates. Rents in the San Francisco area jumped 19% in the year through 2015. Now they've been flat since July. New York rents, which were up 7% in 2015, have been decelerating for a couple of years, declining 0.4% in July. For the first time since 2010, it's now easier to build wealth over an 8-year period by renting a home and investing in stocks and bonds rather than by buying and accumulating equity, according to a national rent versus buy index of 23 cities produced by Florida Atlantic University and Florida International University faculty. Home prices are high and rising mortgage rates are adding to the cost of ownership. Renting is now so much more favorable than buying in places like Dallas and Denver. Let's see. And here's the juicy part. Because what I think we need to get at here is what this feels like, right? It feels a lot like 2006, 2007 in terms of overbuilding, maybe not the right kind of homes, but a right kind of construction, but overbuilding. Housing markets and strong economies are cooling in part because incomes haven't kept pace with rising prices and borrowing costs. Dallas and Denver have reached so far into favorable rental territory that they look like Miami right before it crashed in the last decade. The difference now is that neither market is experiencing the kind of speculation and risky lending that inflated the last housing bubble. I would argue that's not true. Maybe not the exact kind, but we sure are emulating it in an awful lot of ways, just in different ways. Let's see. The slowdown in the rental market coincides with a rise in home ownership among millennials, which jumped to 36.5% in the second quarter from 35.3% a year earlier. Let's all be really honest here. That's less than 1% and in no way could account for this, except for a very minor blip. It's both the supply and demand, according to one pundit. There has been a lot of construction and investment in rental, but there's also softer demand. So what does that equal for us? Let's talk about that when we continue. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break, so don't go away. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right. Aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. We are kind of taking a look at the rental market here, and we're seeing Seattle as being at a point where it looks like things are, at the very least, if you're trying to be even generous, describing it as softening, I think would be a very realistic, conservative thing to say. And what does that tell us about the rest of the rental market? I think that we all need to be aware of things like this. If we wanted to think about, communities that are canaries in the coal mine, you would think that Seattle would be one of those. But here's something else that's really interesting. And I think it informs a little bit what's going on, at least economically. This is the headline from Zero Hedge, and again, we will frequently put our tinfoil hat on when we read articles from Zero Hedge. However, when they are simply passing along data that has been provided by the typical reliable sources, or at least reliable as we can get, that they're a good source, and they will oftentimes compare and contrast that data with other data that I think is a new and interesting perspective on these things. But the headline is 660,000 more job openings than unemployed workers as people quitting hits an all-time high. So first of all, let's settle that one. First, what this is saying is that if every single person wanted a job, they could have one. In other words, we could have zero unemployment. There are 660,000 more job openings in the United States right now than there are unemployed people. And at the same time that's happening, we've seen an interesting uptick in the number of people who have simply quit. And not like quit and decided not to work, although I'm sure, some portion of the folks who quit do that, but just folks who are so confident, their confidence in the employment landscape is so good that they're just quitting to go get another, without any fear of getting another job. What's most interesting about that? I suppose we could have arguments about the numbers and how it's interesting so many jobs are available. What's most interesting is the psychological picture that paints. That's a lot of confidence. With record numbers of people being willing to quit, what does that say? When someone is willing to say, all right, I'm out, that really speaks to a confident person. Now, it also can feed other things that aren't so great. For instance, real income went up, I think 0.03 or 0.3% last quarter, but spending went up 0.04%. So we're spending more than we're getting in terms of an increase in our wages. Job openings have increased since a low in July of 2009. They returned to the pre-recession level in March 2014. They surpassed the pre-recession peak in August of 2014. Hires have increased since a low in June 2009 and have surpassed pre-recession levels. Quits have increased since a low in September of 2009 and have surpassed pre-recession levels. There were 3.6 million people who just quit their job. For most of the JOLTS history, which is the data here, the number of hires measured throughout the month has exceeded the number of job openings measured only on the last business day of the month. At the end of the most recent recession in June 2009, there were 1.2 million more hires throughout the month than there were job openings in the last business day of the month. So this is the good news part, right? There's interesting things that we can try to tease out, but this tells us a couple of things. One of the underpinnings of strong real estate, and I've made this argument all along since almost since the first show, employment, having jobs that can facilitate you being able to make payments on a loan, right? That's how you build credit. You need to have a certain amount of employment in order to make a mortgage payment. So that is a good thing. People being confident enough that they feel like they can quit a job to go find another, or that the market's good enough that quitting is A-okay. Those are all good things. They speak to a very strong employment market, and they speak to a high level of confidence on the part of the folks who are in there. So when folks have a high level of confidence in that, I think it bleeds over into, I can afford to buy a house. I can afford to do more things. Now, we've seen that also expressed in terms of taking on greater debt as it relates to auto loans, those types of things. Some things that scare us a little bit, right? Because the amount of debt, we're also seeing a bubble in the amount of debt people are willing to take on, which should be concerning. But overall, that sets an interesting stage, right? We have people who are super confident about what's happening right now. So with this rental situation, what do we do? Well, first, this should absolutely be a flare to those of you who perhaps own properties that typically compete with apartments in some of the metro areas. With a softening like this, you can anticipate that if your property that you rent you would consider on par with apartment style living, you might want to take extra special care in how you're managing your current tenants, or at least be aware of it if you're about to put that property on the market and we're calculating that you were going to charge X amount of rent. You may need to reevaluate that. You may not be able to rent it for what you think. So if you've got a condo, particularly an apartment that went condo, and for all intents and purposes, it's an apartment, it's just a condo to you, it's going to be considered the same thing as anybody who's an apartment dweller who's trying to get out of that apartment lifestyle. But I think this could spell an opportunity, because remember, we've got confident people, everybody's getting jobs, and that confidence is going to equal something. And it's going to it's going to equal people wanting to increase or improve their living situation. Well, how do you do that? You move out of an apartment. If you're taking an elevator and you don't have a garage to get to your unit, you're probably thinking about moving. How many people here remember living in apartments? I can remember the days when all of my buyer clients were apartment dwellers who wanted to get the heck out. Now, that number has shifted over the years. It's kind of upticked a little bit recently, but not a lot. It's not as much as I would expect it to be. But these are folks who are going to be looking to move up. So if you are somebody that owns a property or is looking to buy a property in a market, here's one thing I would do. If you're a new first-time investor, don't buy a condo. I wouldn't. I would not buy in these marketplaces, and you can get the data to crunch in these various metros and figure out what the dynamic is in those areas. I right now would not buy properties that would tend to exist on the terms of consumers of rentals, right? As a renter who would go out and look for a property to rent. If I'm in an apartment and I don't like it, and I want to get rid of apartment living, and I'm out now looking for a new unit to live in, and I'm finding a condo that also has an elevator, that also doesn't have a garage, right? What am I getting that's a benefit? Nothing, right? But if you are one that's a step up, what would be a step up? Maybe a duplex, right? Half of someone renting half of a duplex. Obviously, a single family residential home would be a move up. Typically, apartment dwellers want to move to 3-bedroom, 2-bath scenarios, simply because most apartments in the areas where I'm in are 2-bedroom, 1.5-bath frequently. The more modern ones are usually 2 full baths, even if it's just 2 bedrooms. But you need to be seen as the upgrade, right? So if you've got an existing property, if you consider yourself an upgrade from an apartment, great. If you either own an existing property or you're thinking about buying a property that would be on par with apartment living, I don't think you should go. I think that deal should be something you consider not doing. And you should maybe even consider taking advantage of the highness of the market and selling that property and buying something that might be a little bit more lucrative, maybe even another marketplace. But this feels like a pivot point. And again, we chat about pivot points, and we've covered an awful lot, right? Here we are more than halfway through 2018. And how many pivot points have we talked about, right? We talked about a bunch the second half of 2017. We've talked about quite a few 2018 where it feels like we're seeing that moment where things are shifting. And this feels like another one, particularly since we're seeing such big changes in metros. If I'm not mistaken, the last one was not focused on rental markets, but it was on metros where we actually saw homes suddenly getting sold, taking longer to get sold and selling for less. Markets like Sacramento and Las Vegas that we've treated as canaries in the coal mine before are showing softening signs of their markets. And actually, let me give you the exact numbers. Sacramento housing in July, sales down 2.2% year over year, active inventory up 20%. Las Vegas, real estate in August, sales down 3% year over year, inventory up 20% year over year. And when we start to see that level of synchronicity, right? Inventory up 20% in 2 markets that we've been watching as indicator markets. And when we see very similar declines in sales in those 2 markets, Las Vegas being a little bit more of a decline than Sacramento, at what point do we start saying, you know what, when we're seeing this across geographic areas, when do we call that a trend? When do we call that a national trend? And it seems like we're getting close. So obviously, in my opinion, this is an opportunity for folks to sit back, analyze your holdings, figure out what's going on in your local marketplaces, decide what your next move needs to be based on this data. I think to maintain a robust rental portfolio going forward, things I would be thinking: A, am I still an upgrade property? Am I still a top goal property? In other words, as things get better, as we've talked about, as people's confidence gets higher, as more and more folks have gainful employment, right? Which is happening. And that encourages people to want to improve their situations. Am I a thing that they would consider as an improvement to their situation? Well, in a marketplace where for the last 7 years, all we've been building is apartments, single family residential is going to look awfully nice to an awful lot of folks who are tired of that setup. Maybe it's time to do a few things. One, if you don't hold one of those properties, but you don't want to liquidate, maybe you need to make sure that you can absorb a reduction in your rents in order to draw the kind of tenants that you're going to need. I'm not suggesting you do it. I mean, you want to let the reality on the ground dictate what you do. But if your finances are tight, in other words, if you're only positive cash flow by a couple of $100 a month on these properties, you may want to change your investment situation so that you have a greater monthly return on investment, or figure something else out. If I had things that tight and I saw what was going on with these markets, I would be liquidating those properties and investing in properties that would potentially give me at least a little bit more elbow room. Perhaps selling, because here's the reason why I say this stuff. I know a lot of folks will say I'm too conservative in a lot of these things, but here's what I saw last time that worried me. Folks had overextended and had all these properties for investments. And if some of them had simply said, hey, you know what? Things are looking a little wonky. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to liquidate 25% of my holdings or 50% of my holdings. And I'm going to consolidate a little bit. I'm going to strengthen my herd of investments by culling it taking the ones that produce the least per month, liquidating those, and then either refinancing or maybe even holding the cash, whatever you want to do. These folks would have come out of that whole situation much better. All I'm suggesting is that if we're heading into a similar situation, that kind of consolidation could be a good call. For an existing investor who might feel a little overextended or have an awful lot of properties, it may be time to cull that inventory down a little bit, get maybe a little bit more liquidity, or pull the liquidity out of the others and maybe put a portion of that into your other properties in order to reduce the monthly expenses on those, right? I know it's a horribly conservative suggestion, but something to think about, and I think it's worth it given the kind of trends we're seeing. All right, folks. Thanks again for listening. As always, the goal is to leave you with more value in terms of cranking the knowledge up to 11 than in time you invested in listening to the show. Hope we've achieved that today. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you all next time.